well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you so much for coming to Wild and Weird Con 2022. So my name is Emily Uldrich, and I am the educator at the Southern Ohio Museum and Cultural Center in Portsmouth, Ohio. So today I'll be talking a lot about the Grave Creek Mound, which remains a West Virginia unsolved mystery. So before we dive into this subject, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of the sponsors that allowed me to be here with you today. So I have to thank the museum, of course, for making this possible. And then I also have to thank Joe and Braun at Wild and Weird West Virginia for inviting me to come and be here with you today. The museum is also sponsored by the Ohio Arts Council. Our local foundation is the Slated Foundation. City of Portsmouth sponsors us, and then also the Richard D. Martin Foundation and the Southern Ohio Medical Center. So at the Southern Ohio Museum and Cultural Center, we are an art museum, and so we work with art all the way from prehistory all the way through contemporary art. And one of our permanent exhibitions is titled Art of the Ancients. So we actually have the largest collection of prehistoric Native American artifacts that's on display in the region. So we have over 10,000 objects that are always out for the public all the time. It's also free to come to the museum, so we're open Tuesday through Friday from 10 in the morning until 5 in the evening, and also Saturdays from 1 to 5. In addition, we also have special events. For example, tomorrow at 1, we're having an artist reception for Chris Pico, who is a Cleveland artist. So we have rotating exhibitions, about 5 every year. We also host concerts, and we have a performing art affiliate, Cirque d'Art Theater, that does circus and acrobatic art and dance. And they have several performances every year as well. So you can see some of the items that are in the collection, and their kind of overview of the gallery there. So we're moving from Ohio here to West Virginia. So here we've got a map of West Virginia, and we are down here in Logan, and we're going to be talking about the Grave Creek Mound, which is in Moundsville, up here at the base of the northern Panhandle. So this is a photograph of the Grave Creek Mound, and the Grave Creek Mound is famous because at one point in time it is the tallest prehistoric Native American mound in the entire country, in North America. So it was reported originally to be nearly 70 feet tall. And you can see if you look closely, there is a spiral pathway that leads to the top of the mound, and there are 2 people climbing the mound here, so you can see how huge it really is. And then also in the background, you can see how it towers above these 2-story houses and the neighborhood that surrounds it. So the Grave Creek Mound is built in the Grave Creek Flats. And the Grave Creek Flats are about a quarter mile from the Ohio River. So this is the top of the mound, and you can see in the background the Ohio River and the bridge across it. Over here we can see the historical marker for the Grave Creek Mound and the mound there in the background. So this mound is believed to be related to the prehistoric people that we call the Adena. So these people, as far as we know, did not have a written language, so we don't know what they called themselves, but the reason they called them Adena is because there was a similar mound on the estate of Ohio's first governor in Chillicothe, which was once the capital of Ohio, and he called his estate Adena, which he read in a book, and it was supposed to be a Hebrew term for a delightful place. So that's where we get that term. It has nothing to do with anything Native American. It was just an arbitrary term that was applied to these people. So the Grave Creek Flats were settled in the late 1700s by a gentleman named Joseph Tomlinson. So this is really before people started settling what was then the western frontier. And so when he got to the Grave Creek Flats, it was all densely wooded. He reported that there were 48 prehistoric mounds in the vicinity, including earthen walls. So he rightfully equated a lot of these mounds with Indian graves. So a lot of times, especially in these conical mounds, we will find prehistoric burials. And because of these Indian mounds and graves, he named the area Grave Creek. So to the south was Big Creek, he called Big Grave Creek, and to the north was a small creek, which he called Little Grave Creek. And so that's how Grave Creek gets its name. So this is a 1904 photograph, and you can see the Grave Creek Mound here kind of has a flat top to it, and you can see that it still has pretty dense woods growing out of the mounds. So when the early settlers and explorers came to the continent, what they found was these mounds and earthen formations were all covered in woods. So as I said, the original dimensions of the Grave Creek Mound were nearly 70 feet tall, making it the tallest mound in the country. They said that the base of the mound was a little over 850 feet across, and then it had a flat top. You can see the top of it, and that last photograph was flat, and that was about 50 feet across the top of the mound, that flat top. They estimated 2,500 cubic yards of earth, which makes it about 3,700 tons. It's a lot. They also reported that surrounding this mound was a 40-foot wide ditch, which was 5 feet deep. So today, if you go to the Grave Creek Mound, it's not quite as tall. It is now 62 feet tall, which makes it the second tallest mound in the country. The tallest mound standing at this point is in Miamisburg, Ohio, and it is 65 feet tall. So originally, the Grave Creek Mound was the tallest mound, and we'll talk a little bit about what happened to it, the crest of the mound, to make it a little bit smaller. So the estimate today for the amount of earth that's inside of it is way bigger than what they said. So we are talking 60,000 tons of earth. And the way that these mounds were constructed was by people carrying basket loads of dirt and piling them one by one into the mound. And they know this because they found remains of these woven baskets, and then also when you look into a cross-section of these mounds, you can see the different colors of dirt built up in little pockets and layers. They call it lensing, where you can see where they built this mound by hand. So it would certainly take a lot of work to make this happen. So it's interesting that the original diameter of the mound was 850 feet. Now they report it at 240 feet across. And there was one radiocarbon date that was associated with this mound, and it is estimated to be around 200 BC. So one thing to keep in mind when we talk about radiocarbon dates is that they are an estimate. So it's based on atmospheric levels of isotopes of carbon, and those fluctuate through time. They used to think that they were more constant, so now they realize that they went up and down and they have to calibrate their dates. So a lot of times, certain levels of these isotopes will coordinate to multiple dates in the prehistoric timeline, they think. So we have to keep in mind that these are estimates. What I find to be interesting is the prehistoric people that they associate with this mound, the Adena, were believed to be around from about 1000 BC through about 500 BC. The radiocarbon date comes from 200 BC, and that is what the prehistoric people in the region we call Hopewell. And so these are a little bit later. They were supposed to be around from 500 BC till around AD 500. But what's also interesting is archaeologists today kind of argue about whether the Adena and Hopewell were the same people or whether it was a continuation of the people. So they have a lot of the same items, these mysterious items that we don't know what their function was, but obviously they share the same iconography and were familiar with the same objects, so that's why archaeologists think that maybe they were the same people. Plus you have to think, over 1,000 years, trends are going to change a little bit. So the fact that they were that consistent with the objects that came in the mounds is suggestive that there was at least some cultural continuity between the Adena people and the Hopewell people. And then here we have an illustration of the Grave Creek Mound, and this came out of the Smithsonian Institution's first publication, which was Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, published in 1848. And if you guys have questions or comments along the way, feel free to interrupt me. I'm fine with that. So there, yes, go ahead.
Really quick.
Sure.
Do you all know if once they actually start putting the cast away people, like from the very bottom of it? Do they actually go any further down, or do they just like do this and then like cover up with dirt?
That's a good question. So a lot of times the initial burial that the mound covers will be right at ground level or into the ground a couple feet. So usually it's not super deep underneath the first layer of earth. And then we'll see as we go through this that the mounds are oftentimes reused or built up in layers. So there's usually an initial burial near ground level or just under ground level, and then that's covered up with a low mound. And then a lot of times they'll bury another person in the mound, and they'll build this mound up in layers. So they estimate that over many thousands of years, prehistoric people used and recycled these earthworks. And sometimes these people come from what they think are very different cultures, but they still use these mounds. And I find it interesting, they call some of, at one point, they stopped putting in the effort to put in all the basket loads of earth, and they would just dig a pit into the mound and bury someone right there and then just cover them up to the surface of the mound. And that's a practice that continues today. You'll actually see some of the best preserved mounds are preserved because they're in modern day graveyards. And there are settlers and even people, we've got a graveyard in Piketon just north of Portsmouth, and there's a burial at the base of one of the prehistoric mounds that dates to 1985. So those intrusive mound burials are still happening today. So the Grave Creek Mound, when Joseph Tomlinson came, he preserved it. He wanted to keep the mound as it was. So years later, his grandson in 1838 decided to excavate the mound and see if they could find what was in it. So his excavation was not really recorded. They had a brief report in a newspaper in Cincinnati the year that it happened, but that paper is now defunct and that report is pretty well lost. But there was an additional report that was done in the American Pioneer in 1843. And so the grandson of Joseph Tomlinson was A.B. Tomlinson, Abelard Tomlinson, and he was the one that organized the excavation of the Grave Creek Mound. So this is a diagram also that comes from the Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, and it kind of shows you what they found there in the mound. So the first thing they did, if I can get my laser pointer to work, was dig a trench into the mound. And then at the base of the mound, they found one burial chamber. The second thing they did is they went to the top of the mound and they dug a shaft down into the mound. And about halfway down the mound, they found an additional burial chamber. And then they put another trench into the side of the mound to see if they found anything else. So really, this excavation from 1838 is only a partial excavation. The mound has never been completely excavated. So it is possible that there are additional burials and artifacts within the mound, but excavating mound burials today is taboo. Native American people think that these people were buried for a reason, and they feel like they don't need to be dug up, and their artifacts that are found with them really shouldn't be displayed because they were meant to be buried with the people that were originally interred. And then in addition, you can see at the very top of the mound is this 3-story building. That was an observation tower that Abelard Tomlinson built so that you could climb up on the top of the mound and see the surrounding area. So that lower burial vault, what they did is they dug a trench 7 feet wide, 10 feet high. In order to stabilize it, they bricked up the walls. And they said once they got to the center of the mound earth was so hard and dense that they didn't even need to put in the brickwork anymore. So they found this burial vault in the center at the base of the mound, and it was oriented the long way north and south, and it was 8 feet wide by 12 feet long. And it was made with timber logs that they set upright to make the rectangle, and then they used logs across the top of it, and then layered on top of the roof of it was sandstone. And within this lower burial vault, they found 2 skeletons. By analyzing them, they determined that one skeleton was male and one skeleton was female. And they were buried with 650 what they reported as ivory beads. And then looking back on that, they think that those were actually made out of shell. So oftentimes in these early reports, if it looked sort of like ivory, they'd call it ivory. They didn't know exactly what it was. And then they also knew that there were, at one point in time, mastodons and woolly mammoths roaming North America, and they weren't quite sure about the timeline, and so they thought some of these might have actually been ivory, but they think now that they were marine and freshwater shells They also found what was called an ivory gorget, or gorget. So a gorget is named after the medieval armor that protects the throat. And so they found these items associated with skeletons in that manner, and then when the Spanish explorers came in the 1500s, they made illustrations of people wearing these objects attached to necklaces. So we've got some examples at the very top. Usually a gorget has 2 holes punched through it for attachment. This is an actual drawing of the gorget that came out of the Grave Creek Mound. Unfortunately, this artifact is lost, so that's part of the Grave Creek Mound mystery, is what happened to the artifacts that came out of the mound. But here are some examples that are in the Southern Ohio Museum collection. You can see here there's a pendant made of shell, and then to the right is a gorget made out of shell. And then for an example, we've also got some pieces from the museum collection that show you how the marine shells would be put together to make a necklace. So these are some pink shells that came from the ocean, very far away from us. So one of the things that's impressive about these people is they had a continental trade network. So they don't get the credit they deserve for the sophistication of the civilization that was here and how far they traveled and traded goods at a time when they didn't even have horses to move around the country. So we have some additional smaller shell beads on this side. And I do have to thank my sister-in-law, Lacey Davis, for taking these lovely photographs that we have of the museum collection. So moving on to the upper burial vault. So this is when they dug that shaft into the top of the mound, about 35 feet down, they found the upper burial vault. What's interesting is the upper burial vault is oriented in the opposite direction of the lower burial vault. So the lower burial vault, the long way, is north-south. The upper burial vault is oriented east-west. So that also tells you that these people were thinking about those directions. They were in tune with where the sun rose, where the sun set, all kinds of celestial events. So this vault was actually it was a little more narrow, but it was longer, 8 feet by 18 feet. As they dug that shaft into the mound, they did the same thing. They lined that cylinder shaft with brickwork to stabilize it. And then this had the same kind of construction. There were logs that they used to make the walls of the vault, and then they also had the logs on the roof. So they did find one skeleton in the upper burial vault. It was so decayed that they were unable to determine whether it was male or female. So these are some illustrations that come from the museum by the Grave Creek Mound, and they're kind of showing you, they thought the mound was built in stages. So like we were saying, there was a kind of a low rise that they think was natural, and they dug into that low rise to build the first burial vault, then they made a mound on top of that, and then they added the upper burial vault into the original mound, added another layer of earth, and then at a later point in time, they added even more earth to create this largest mound. So in the upper burial vault, they found more artifacts with a single skeleton than they did in the lower burial vault. So 1,700 shell beads, 500 univalve shells, so those are clam shells, those are probably fresh water. But the 1,700 shell beads were probably marine beads that someone traveled or traded to the ocean or the Gulf of Mexico to get. They found 5 copper bracelets. So they think that prehistoric people did not have smelting technology, so they couldn't melt down and cast the metal, but what they did was they would hammer it out cold to make sheets, and then they'd roll those sheets into bracelets and rings, or use those sheets to make ornaments. And then the sourcing of the copper is also impressive, because the copper they would get from mines surrounding Lake Superior in Michigan, and then they would also travel to the lower Appalachian Mountains, so we're talking Georgia and the Carolinas, in order to obtain this copper material. And so there's some illustrations here that come from the Grave Creek Mound Museum, and you can see the bracelets, and then we've got a color photograph down here from the Southern Ohio Museum collection showing similar bracelets that were found in a Hopewell Mound across the river in Kentucky. In addition, they found 2 of those gorgets that we're talking about, and 1 engraved stone tablet, which will end up being the most controversial item that came from the Grave Creek Mound. So they found sheets of mica. So on the right here are illustrations of these mica sheets. So mica is a mineral that also comes from the lower Appalachian Mountains, and it's found in these thin sheets, and it's very shiny, and they could use it for things like mirrors, but they would also cut out ornaments from this mica. And then in Portsmouth, at the Portsmouth Earthworks Complex, they actually found cartloads of like 2 foot by 2 foot sheets of mica. So this is like a horse cart wagon filled with this stuff. So it's pretty impressive that these people were traveling, not only traveling that far, but like bringing back that amount of material. So this is one of the objects that came out of the Tremper Mound in West Portsmouth, and it was cut out of mica in the shape of a bear. And so they think the ones that came out of the Grave Creek Mound were about 2.5 inches by 1.5 inches, and they had anywhere from 2 to 4 holes drilled into them. So the drawing here is an estimate. They think that maybe they were woven together to make like a breastplate or an ornament for someone to wear. So in addition to the 2 lower vault burials and the upper vault burial, they also found multiple cremations that were deposited into the mound. And so it makes sense that they found a radiocarbon date that came from the Hopewell period, because the Hopewell people are known to have what they call charnel houses, and these are places where they cremate and process the dead. And there's an example here of an artist's illustration of maybe what the charnel house looked like. So when the Spanish explorers came in the 1500s, one of the things that they found that the tribes had were these ancestor houses. So this is also like a charnel house. They would display the bones of their ancestors, and they weren't doing this in a way to demean them, they were doing this in a way to preserve what they had left of their ancestors and to venerate them. But one of the things that they did, if there was an enemy tribe, they tried to go and attack and burn down their enemy's charnel house, because if you could destroy what remained of their ancestors, that meant that their leader was not fit to be in service. So one of the things they try to do is really protect these ancestor houses, and I think this is a tradition that dates back many thousands of years with prehistoric people. So Abelard Tomlinson was an interesting guy. He decided to display the artifacts that they discovered in the mound. So at the base of the mound, surrounding that lower burial vault, he actually built what he called the Rotunda Museum. So they made about a 28-foot in diameter circular room that housed the museum. He bricked up the walls, and then they put the artifacts and some of the skeletons actually along the walls within wire cages, and then there was kind of a part in the middle of the displayed artifacts, and then the whole room was lit with tallow candles. But it ended up that the museum wasn't the most popular place, so you're inside of a mound, and they made a plaster ceiling, so like all the moisture that came through in the area soaked through the ceiling, so like as you walked in there, like dirty, moldy plaster would drip all over your head. And then the museum also met with its demise because visitors to the museum would help themselves to the artifacts and leave with them. So after not too long, there wasn't much left in the museum for people to look at. So this is kind of the history of the top of the mound and the reason why it's no longer the tallest mound in North America. So in 1837, we talked about how Tomlinson built that 3-story observation tower at the top of the mound. In 1848, he opened that museum at the bottom, which closed within a couple years. And then in 1860, they built a saloon on the top of the mound, so they probably had to take down the observation tower and make a foundation for their saloon. The saloon didn't last that long. In the late 1800s, they built a dance hall on top of the mound, and so they had parties up there. And then by the time the turn of the century rolled around in 1900, the city wanted to develop that area because it was right in the middle of downtown Elizabethtown and Moundsville, and so they had a plan to demolish the mound. And so thanks to the Wheeling chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, they got together and decided this was such an important monument that they needed to preserve it. So they raised money and made a campaign to save the mound and buy it. And then it was purchased by the state of West Virginia in 1909. And so a couple years after that, they leveled off the summit, got rid of the dance hall and any remains of activity that had been happening up there. They built this low brick wall, so you can see this is the top of the mound looking for the penitentiary. And there's a low sandstone wall, and then there's also a directional monument which shows you north, south, east, and west. And then this is an early picture of the mound where you can actually see a photograph of the original rotunda, or not the rotunda, but the observation tower at the top of the mound. So in 1945, they were utilizing this little stone structure at the base of the mound as a museum, probably to display artifacts that didn't even come from the mound, since most of those were lost. But then in 1978, there was a guy named Delph Nerona who campaigned to make this the state archaeological museum. So there is now the Delph Nerona Museum that is right next to the Grave Creek Mound. Delph Nerona was an immigrant from Hong Kong who moved here to West Virginia and studied prehistory and really took a liking to it. And this is actually the repository for all of the artifacts in West Virginia. So most states, if there's artifacts that are discovered on public property, those then become state property, and then they are displayed usually by chosen institutions or museums. So the Delph Nerona Museum is the museum where all of those artifacts that are found around the state of West Virginia are deposited. So they keep those in storage, and they also have some really nice geology and natural history displays there. So now on to the most controversial item that came out of the Grave Creek Mound was the Grave Creek tablet. So you can see some illustrations here of this stone tablet. And so it wasn't just an engraved tablet, it was engraved with markings which looked a heck of a lot like a primitive alphabet. So they sent drawings of this over to Europe in 1842, and there was a convention that they held in Copenhagen, Denmark, and they had those archaeologists from Europe check it out and see what they thought about it. So the archaeologists in Europe thought it was an authentic ancient alphabet. So we've got some quotes here that come out of a report written by Henry Schoolcraft, who was an archaeologist here in America, and he did a report about the Grave Creek Mound, which was published in 1845. After he heard about their convention in 1842 in Denmark, he decided he wanted to go visit the mound himself. So he visited the Grave Creek Mound in 1843 and wrote up this report. So he says, the object which has excited the greatest degree of interest was a small flat stone. So we're talking probably 2.5 inches by a couple inches. So he said the stone was of an ovate shape, so kind of egg-shaped, oval-shaped, containing an inscription of unknown characters. Mr. Raffin was one of those anthropologists and archaeologists at the convention in Denmark, and he said that it was so striking that at first sight we are led to believe that we have a Celtiberic inscription lying before us. So this was the language of the Celts in Ireland and Great Britain. So that was the language that they thought it was using when they went to that convention in Denmark. So there were a lot of versions of the Grave Creek tablet that were published over the years, and some of them are more accurate than others. So the first one that got sent to the convention is quite a bit different from what the real stone looks like. So those anthropologists and archaeologists working in Europe didn't have the authentic inscription to work from. So their translations and ideas about it were probably a little bit off because of that. At one point in time, the Grave Creek tablet actually ended up in the collection of Edwin Davis. So that first publication that the Smithsonian put out, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, was put together by two people, Squire and Davis. This is that Davis. And so Davis was from Ohio. He had a huge collection of artifacts that came from mounds all over the country. And in 1850s, he commissioned an artist named James Plunkett to make watercolor illustrations, and he published this book, Sketches of Monuments and Antiques Found in the Mounds, Tombs, and Ancient Cities of America. So within this are sketches of the Grave Creek tablet, and Davis had the original in his collection. So he replicated the drawings that were published over the years of it that were inaccurate, and then he also had James Plunkett make a watercolor illustration of what the stone actually looked like. So the original stone is now lost. We have no idea where it is, so that's one of those other additional mysteries of the Grave Creek Mound, is what happened to the Grave Creek stone. There is a single photograph of the authentic artifact, and that's up here in black and white, and that was thought to have been taken when it was in Davis's collection. At one point in time, it ended up at the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian made wax casts of it. So these are all casts that are painted of the Grave Creek. I think this one's in plaster and those two are in wax. So those are the closest thing we have to the original are these casts of the stone. What happened to it after the Smithsonian had it, no one knows. They thought it might have went to the British Museum where a lot of our artifacts ended up. So you have to understand, at the time when this was happening, no one in America really cared about this stuff. There were still warring with Native American tribes across the western frontier and in the plains. And if your grandpa got killed by an Indian, maybe you don't care so much about whatever junk they have buried in the mounds. So they sold a lot of this stuff off to Europe, and you can go to the British Museum and look at it now. So there's a lot of controversy surrounding this tablet. There's an early archaeologist named Charles Whittlesey who wrote an article in the Western Reserve and Northern Ohio Historical Society called Archaeological Frauds. And front and center in this report of archaeological frauds was the Grave Creek stone. So they assumed that because they had never found this kind of writing anywhere else and no one could identify it, that someone had played a prank on Abelard Tomlinson. So in 1847, George Squire, one of those authors of the Ancient Writings of the Mississippi Valley, looked at the stone. He pronounced it to be a fabrication. Also, Davis, who we just talked about, after having it in his collection, also decided that it was a fraud. And then there was another conference in 1875 held at Nancy in France, where the European archaeologists and anthropologists took a second look at the stone, and they decided that it was genuine, and it was an inscription in ancient Canaanite. So they think this is what we call now Paleo-Hebrew. It came from people that lived near Israel and Lebanon. Whittlesey obviously disagreed with the conclusion that the European archaeologists came to. So there's a guy named Mr. Bing, and Mr. Bing was French, but he had made a dictionary of ancient Canaanite that was translated into French, and he was one of the people that took a look at the Grave Creek tablet, and he said that it was for sure Canaanite, and it was related to Phoenician. So Phoenician are some of those people that lived at the same time, kind of in the same area. And then in this report, you can see some of the different letters. The top row, we've got letters in ancient Greek that are similar to those on the Grave Creek tablet. Etruscan, Runic, so ruins of Great Britain, ancient Gaelic. We've got Phoenician down here, Old British, Celtic language, and then at the bottom, I love it, they call it Appalachian. So that is the language of the Grave Creek tablet. It is true prehistoric Appalachian. So if we think about the plausibility of this, we can kind of look at what was going on in the area. So in the lands of Canaan and Phoenicia, you can see what stretches down into modern day Israel, were people that were a seafaring people. So they had trade routes that went all along the Mediterranean. They traded with Memphis and Carthage, some of those major ancient cities in Europe and Northern Africa. And if we look a little bit further into this, we can see, so here's the Mediterranean, and if we look at the ocean currents, if you were to set sail off out of the Mediterranean, the natural currents of the ocean are going to take you right over to North America. So they think that North America was settled during the Ice Age across the Bering Strait, but there is evidence and reports that come out of the coast of Africa here that there were people that sailed across to South America, Central America, and North America during prehistoric times. And then we also can look at the winds. So the winds also send you from the Mediterranean across the way here. It'd take about a month to cross the ocean. So it would be quite a long trip, but it's not outside of the realm of possibility. And so here we've got some stone carvings of the ships that were used by the Phoenicians. So you can see that they did have sails, so they look a lot like modern day ships. And then here we've got an illustration, not quite in proportion, of them moving huge timber logs from areas in Africa and Europe back to Phoenicia. So this was a serious operation, and they were able to do some major trading of materials. And so here we have an ancient calendar written in Phoenician, and so you can see how some of these markings look sort of similar to those they find on the Grave Creek tablet. So the best evidence that we have for contact between these Paleo-Hebrew people and North America comes from North Carolina, and or South Carolina, one of the Carolinas. They found this stone, which is called the Back Creek tablet. When they first found it, the archaeologists from the Smithsonian, Thomas Cyrus, I don't remember, but anyway, the guy that found it thought that it was 100 years old, and it was Cherokee script, because the Cherokee didn't have a written language until about the 1700s. And so he thought that it was written in Cherokee. And then later, somebody flipped the stone over and found out that it almost completely matched this text, which was from an old Masonic book. And it was written in Hebrew, and it said, "Holiness to the Lord." And so there were people that think that someone copied this inscription and put it on this tablet and made a fake stone for someone to find to link the Hebrews to modern day Americans. Prehistoric Americans. And this is something that happened a lot back then. There's a lot of people that discredited the Native Americans and said that they couldn't have possibly built the mounds, and it must have been people that had come over from Europe, like the lost tribes of Israel. So there was a lot of that floating around. But what I find is especially interesting about this is in this inscription, it doesn't completely match the one from the Masonic text. So the experts say that in the Back Creek tablet, there is a comma and a letter Q that were not discovered until the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so this was found in the 1800s. Dead Sea Scrolls, we're talking about mid-1900s, so that's quite a bit later. So someone either had to have known something that no one knew until the next century, or it's authentic. So the Smithsonian has this in their collection. They consider it to be part of their archaeological fraud collection, but they do have it on loan to the Back Creek Museum, which is run by the Cherokee people down there. And the Cherokee people do think it's authentic, and they think if the Smithsonian doesn't think it's authentic, then they should just give it to them so they can bury it back in the mound. Yes?
Why do they have a collection of fraudulent items?
Because over the years, they collected all kinds of material. So they spent a lot of the 1800s and early 19th century digging up mounds across the country. And it was basically, they just come through, plow through the mound, take anything that was of value and take it back to the Smithsonian. And so that's where a lot of their material came from. And in that material, there are multiple items that they think maybe aren't authentic. And they're not real big on giving up things, so they keep them as examples so they can show people that there are frauds along the way. And there probably are some frauds, but we'll look into whether this is a fraud or not. Okay, so there's some translations that have been made. What I think is really interesting is it's obvious that there's not anyone that really knows the language of Phoenician or Paleo-Hebrew or Canaanite or Celtic, because all of these translations are wildly different. So we've got one from 1857, which says, "The chief of immigration who reached these places has fixed these statues forever." So we've got another later one, a couple years later, "The grave of one who was assassinated here. May God revenge him, strike his murderer, cutting off the hand of his existence." So there's not much comparison between those two texts. Here's another one, and this one was done by Mr. Bain, who was the guy that made that Canaanite French dictionary. So his says, "Thy orders are laws, thou shinest in impetuous elan and rapid as the chamois." So these elan and chamois, those are like gazelles or antelopes that lived in the area. So they're talking about like how fast and fit these animals are. And he thinks that that came from the Canaanite or Phoenician. So in the 70s, there's a guy named Barry Fell who made an additional translation that he published in his book, America BC. His translation is, "The mound is raised on high for Tassac," that was the name of the guy. "This tile, his queen, caused to be made." Now, the problem is Barry was working off of one of those old inscriptions of the tablet that really was not true to what it looked like. So it's possible that that's really not accurate at all. This gentleman is pretty interesting. So in 2016, there's a guy named Stuart Harris who decided to do a translation of the tablet also. And he was saying that the language was actually ancient Finnish, and he had a theory that people were driven out of Europe and sailed all the way over here and were dropped off near Ohio and Kentucky and became the Indian people, and later more people came over from Europe and those became the Hopo people. But he also, if you like some paranormal history, this guy's got some very far out there theories if you look him up. But he also translated the bottom one, which wasn't even really looking like letters. So his translation says, Champion, love the name of the guy he said was Champion, lovely, created the best family. I think of a wife far away in a meadow, of a woman also at night, naked, in a small cabin. Now a storm of storms struck us. It created grief, wrecked everything somewhat, started a battle among men wretched. I made many great champions. And so the way he came up with that last line was by taking apart the drawing at the bottom and turning it into letters. So that's a little bit far-fetched, which kind of suits the way that this gentleman likes to work. But he's not the only person to take apart the letters to try and make words out of them. There was actually a hoax translation that was ran into the newspapers in 1930, and this guy tried to translate the tablet, and he said he broke apart those letters and said that it's Bill Stump Stone, October 4th, 1838. And you can see how he kind of dissected the letters to turn them into letters that really aren't even on the tablet in order to make his translation. And the other thing is the excavation was over with. The excavation was started in April of 1838, and it was over with in August. So there's no way that he could have signed it October 4th unless that was like somebody's birthday or something, because it does not relate at all to the timing of the excavation. So they think that somebody actually created this version based off of a Charles Dickens book where somebody made a fake translation. So this was something that they hoaxed, and it was published in a scientific magazine, so they think somebody was trying to play a joke on the scientists. So Squire from the Squire and Davis Ancient Monuments decided that it was a fraud because the first mention of the Grave Creek Mound was published in this book called Crania Americana, who was written by a guy named Morton. And Morton put this book together. He took the report from Tomlinson, who was the owner of the mound, and or actually there was a guy that worked with Tomlinson who was, I think, the nephew of Mark Twain, and his last name was Clements. And James Clements was on site for the excavation, made a report. It was published in this Crania Americana, but they didn't mention the Grave Creek tablet. So Squire said because they didn't mention the tablet that it must not be genuine. And then we've got some more reports of fraud. There was a guy that wrote a letter that said that he knew that there was a guy that made the tablet and put it in that mound to fake out Mr. Tomlinson. But then they asked the guy's daughters and sisters' relations, and they said that they had never heard anything about it. The guy was dead. He wasn't there to defend himself. So this is all pure speculation. And then there were eyewitness accounts of people that were actually at the excavation. So Clements was there, and then in a report by another guy who was the director of the Smithsonian Institution, he went through Clements' notes, and he found that he had actually mailed Morton the full list, including the Grave Creek tablet, but Morton just decided not to publish it. So it actually was part of that report, so Squire was completely wrong about that. There was another guy, J.E. Wharton of Portsmouth, who started the Portsmouth Public Library, said he was there at the excavation and saw it come out of the mound. And then there was another guy, Michael Blair Burke, who published a couple books about the Grave Creek Mound, and he actually went through Delph Noronha's catalog reports. So remember the Noronha Museum there by the mound? He had the original reports by Tomlinson of the excavation, and within those reports was able to pinpoint exactly where they found in the mound the tablet, which he said authenticated it. And then most recently, you can tell I'm a little out of date, this is supposed to be 21st century evidence of fraud because this happened in 2008, but there was a guy named David Ostreicher who is an anthropology doctor. He's not associated with any institution. He did his doctoral thesis about the Wallam Olam, which is supposed to be a history of the Lenape Indians, and he said that it was faked. So he's got a whole history of looking up these frauds and fakes. and he did a talk for the West Virginia Archaeological Society, which was entitled Forging the Grave Creek Stone, Who Did It and How It Was Done. So he thought that Clement, who was that nephew of Mark Twain, who was working with Abelard Thomason, had a lot of money in this excavation, but they didn't find enough spectacular things. So he forged this tablet and made this big hoax to make it into a bigger deal than it actually was. And additionally, Ostreicher claims that there's the 1700s book written in Spanish, which goes through all kinds of different ancient languages. And he said that Clement, in forging this tablet, copied out of this book. He said that every letter on the Grave Creek tablet is included in this book, and that there's also sequences of letters that are exactly like the ones on the Grave Creek tablet, including mistakes. So, full disclosure, I do not speak or read Spanish, so I can't tell what exactly is being said in this book, but I tell you what, I can look at lines and letters and see if they match each other. So I went through this book to try and see if what David Ostreicher was saying was true. So I highlighted on some of these illustrations, these are letters that match the Grave Creek tablet. So there are some matching letters. These are not in the exact order. So in the entire book, I was only able to find 2 letters next to each other that were in the same order that they were in the Grave Creek tablet, and those are highlighted here in green. So I don't think that Mr. Ostreicher had enough evidence to be able to support his claims. So it's possible. I'd like to talk to him sometime and get his take on it to see if he could defend his position. But what I also find interesting is he never published this in any kind of academic journal or article. He never wrote a book on it. No institution has stood behind his cause. So I think if it was actually true what he was saying, it would be a huge deal, and he would be putting it out there for all of us to see. But it's not, so I think the Grave Creek tablet remains a mystery. I'm no expert in ancient languages, so I can't tell you what language it is or who made it, but I can tell you that no one yet has really proven it conclusively to be a fraud. And if the Grave Creek tablet is authentic, it is probably one of the most important archaeological finds in the entire hemisphere. So we've got some examples here of what it looked like in Moundsville way back when the first settlers came. So you can see that large mound here. There's additional mounds, lookout points along the hills. They even had some walkways down through here. So we know that it was a major prehistoric settlement. No one questions any of the other materials that came out of the mound. Out of all of those thousands of artifacts that they found within the mound, there's only one piece, a little chunk of a cranium, that's left at the Delphi Nerona Museum. The rest of the artifacts completely missing. So it definitely remains a West Virginia unsolved mystery. We don't know what happened to the Grave Creek tablet. We don't know what language it is. We don't know what translation it is. We don't know if it's real. We don't know if it's a fraud. We don't know what happened to these artifacts. But we do know the mound's still there. It still stands as one of the tallest mounds in the entire country. At one point in time, it was the tallest mound in the country, and that's something that West Virginia has to be able to say is true in their own. So thank you guys so much for coming today. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to attempt to answer them. But yeah, lots of cool things in West Virginia. I also have a table set up in the hallway. I've got some authentic prehistoric Native American artifacts from the Southern Ohio Museum and Cultural Center's educational collection. So come by and see me. Come hold some 1,000-year-old items in your hand and enjoy the rest of your day here at the convention. Thank you.